Good evening and welcome to today's episode of Africa Talks. And today we'll be talking about the stereotypical image of Africa that has been created in the minds of people across the globe and why that image is still lingering with us today. Why Africa, despite so much development culturally, economically, and politically, has still not been able to keep that image away. Why people in US or in India or in other countries still have to go back to those traditional and stereotypical perspectives of understanding Africa. And to talk more about that, we have a group of eminent panelists today. I would like to first welcome Barrister Chuks Okorikwe. Barrister Chuks, welcome to the show. Barrister Chuks is country lead for Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa. And he's joining us today from Nigeria.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to having a wonderful conversation today.
Our second panelist today is Ms. Shrinkla Sahai, who is co-founder and project director of Swayam Foundation. Shrinkla, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Narender. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for organizing this very unique discussion and very, very topical, very significant, absolutely important right now. So thank you for that. I'm really happy to, share the space with all the other panelists here.
It's great to have you today in the show. Our next panelist is Mr. Foster Addo, who is head of the legal team at Exilient Africa. Mr. Addo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yadav. Thank you for giving us this platform to talk about this issue. And I'll look forward to have a very fruitful discussion with my co-panelists and the viewers watching us on Facebook. Thank you.
Great. Our next panelist is Dr. Raymond Lau, who is a lecturer in the history department at Hong Kong Baptist University. Dr. Raymond, welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you very much for your very kind invitation. Happy to be here again, and I look forward to have a very enriching and fruitful discussion and debate with you guys with these very timely and important issues about Africa.
Great. Next panelist is Dr. Michael Duhoa, who is with the African Science Diplomacy and Policy Network. Dr. Michael, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Yadav, and thanks for the panelists. I'm happy to be here. I look forward to have a great conversation on this very important topic that is ravaging the world now.
Great. Friends, today is a very important day for India, and in fact, for the entire world. It was on June 7th, 1893, that our father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who was traveling in a first-class compartment in South Africa, and he was evicted from the train just because of his color. And that was the day when Mahatma Gandhi actually started the Satyagraha. So it was a defining moment. If we come back to 2020 today, we all know Black Lives Matter, the slogan that has been going around on social media and on the roads in several cities of the world. After George Floyd, an African-American, was killed in the US on May 25th. From 1893 to 2020, a lot of things globally have changed, socially, politically, economically, culturally. But there are certain things which have remained unchanged. And one such aspect of our society is racial discrimination. It is still perpetuating, it's still persisting in the society. And in fact, in several countries, in several communities, for a lot of people, race, unfortunately, is still the prism to judge people, to view people, to identify people. And that remains the naked truth in our country, also in India. As far as Africa is concerned, in the last 2-3 decades, we have seen remarkable development in Africa. Africa is the second largest continent, is the second most populous continent. And the best part is Africa is going to be the youngest continent in terms of the demography. So huge demographic dividend is there for Africa. Culturally, it's very diverse. Politically, it's largely stable now as compared to what it was maybe 10 or 20 years back. So all-round development has happened in Africa in last 2 decades. Still, the image that Africa still carries in the eyes of Westerners, in the eyes of maybe Asians like India, is that Africa is still unsafe, Africa is still poor, Africa is still backward. These are the different, ways to identify life in Africa. And Africans, because of that, have to face a lot of discrimination, social boycott, in fact, violence also sometimes due to racism in different parts of the country. So my first question today in the show is, when Africa has changed so much, why the world has still not changed? Why the world is still using those traditional ways to understand and identify Africa and Africans? So I would first request Barrister Chooks to please start today's conversation with his views on why Africa is still, we still look at Africa with the traditional, in the traditional ways and traditional perspectives. Barrister Chooks.
Thank you so much for having me. And I must say that your question at this point should set the ball rolling, given the fact that recently there have been protests, global protests against discrimination against the black man or blacks generally. And we cannot diffuse such protests from the reinforced stereotypical way in which media, has projected Africa for a lot of years now. For instance, the view or what is seen as Africa in the West is an imagery of poverty, is an imagery of war and disease and several other negativity. So such projections tend to reinforce racism. Some using those projections believe that, they are far better than an average African. So they see an average African as inferior to them. So the media, in a way, has perpetuated this stereotyping of the black man in so many ways. At the same time, we should also bear in mind that development issues also affect issues of racism. For a couple of years now, you would recall the incident that happened in Libya when a couple of Africans, were being traded. We had a recent issue of slave trade in the northern part of Africa, that's Libya. So these issues tend to conflate or tend to reinforce racism and the perception of the black man. However, for us to overcome or for us to, in a way, get rid of these stereotypical tendencies, one needs to appreciate the role of cultural integration. I, for one, have benefited immensely from getting to understand the values and cultures of other people. I also believe strongly that cultural integration could also help a long way, in reducing or eliminating the stereotypical tendencies of the average African or the average black man. By cultural integration and getting to understand our cultural peculiarities, differences, we tend to appreciate our diversity and more or less forge a united front to achieve a common objective. Economically today,
Barrister Chooks, I think Barrister Chooks has, raised a very relevant point that how media has been projecting Africa, and I think that has, very important role to play in terms of, actually understanding the real Africa, because what we get to, read in newspapers on, watch on channels is something which is very different from what is actually happening in Africa in reality. So coming to you, Dr. Michael, what's your viewpoint on this issue?
Okay, thank you for having me, and I think this is the best time to talk about this issue concerning the current problem we have with Black Lives Matter. Looking at it, I think, let me start from the Indian context where I am. The society we are in also plays a big role in what we use to perceive other people. So India also has some structural and societal ills. So when we're talking about stereotypes, even within Indians, there is also stereotypes among the Indians. So if within you are not able to fix it, then what do you expect more of someone coming from outside and a Black person for that matter? Let me give you a typical instance. In 2018, I went for a conference at the University of Delhi. So I met a professor of ethnography there. We were discussing some of these issues, and he told me, no, Indians, we are not racist, we are only colorists. So by reinforcing that, what it means, then if you're a Black, in that case, you see that you actually face this, although in some ways, I think we overblown it, but I think the Indian culture plays a role. Then secondly, this, learning about something comes in two ways. Either you hear or you experience. In reality, apart from what the media does, the parents also play a key role. Like the children, what do you teach them? I have a neighbor who tells the children, no, Africans are cannibals, don't go close to them, they will eat you. And this is what the child grows up with. So the older generation also have contributed significantly to this problem that we are facing today. And if I also try to push it further, it's not really the media per se. I think it's more of the international media, because the local media actually try to promote Africa. But the major problem we have is the international media, and people outside Africa, that is actually what they look at. And I'm someone that is very, very cautious about that. Like, let me use the current problem of coronavirus that we have. Africa have made significant progress in this, but nobody's talking about it.
Exactly.
Some countries that don't have any debt yet in Africa, nobody's talking about it. So if media also, that's international media in this context, can keep talking about Africa in this light, I think it's going to play a key role. So from my own point of view, looking at what is happening currently, I think these are the three things for us that have contributed to the problem of where we are. Although there are some other points I would still like to buttress on as we progress in the talk.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point which Dr. Michael has raised. Shrinkla, you have studied at JNU. That's a multicultural university. A lot of Africans, I'm sure, also African students are studying there. What kind of behavior you have seen among maybe your peers or maybe in the community in which you interacted about Africans, and why do you think this identity of this racism against Africans still persists in India?
I think it's a very nuanced and pertinent question. And just also going back to what Chooks and Michael have shared about the importance of media and education. JNU is a very vibrant, culturally vibrant space. Academically, when we think about the shared colonial history that Africa, countries of Africa, and India you've started off this talk with that incident with Gandhiji in South Africa. So I think this shared colonial history is really important. Sadly, somehow it has just gone, there is a lacuna there. It's just gone missing in today's times, because there is more of a colonial hangover than the sense of a shared colonial history that India and Africa have shared. So, for instance, when you look at, you're talking about media, Chooks. So, Narender, I think you would remember there was this barrage of commercials that came up in India in the 2000s very recently, where these beverage companies used these racial stereotypes, showing Africans as savages, as cannibals, or in one of those beverage commercials, there was this African man who was looking for water in the sand, and then finds the tap and doesn't know what to do with the tap, so basically wrenches it out. So it's really outrageous, these kind of representations in media. The problem here is that most Indians also did not find it racist, and in the market research it worked. The commercial worked. Now that is the real problem, So I just want to add one more.
That has been so much normalized in India, that you don't, understand that what actually it connotes, for Africans. Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I just want to add, like,
Yeah.
Chut talked about media, Michael talked about education, the importance of education. I want to talk about one more aspect now, which is about arts and literature. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right after countries in Africa, and of course, after India had gained independence, the post-independence periods for these colonies was very crucial, where uh, artists and writers in both of these places were trying to find their own language, because English had become the colonizers' language, had become the language of education, the medium of education, right? And then what happened to the native languages? So there was a whole movement which was called the Empire Writes Back, where African writers and Indian writers really talked about what is this idea of African English? Why should we talk about, why should we use English just as the British have defined English? We'll define our own sense of grammar. And then there was this whole idea of Indian English. So even now we have this category called Indian English authors. We don't call them English authors. And of course, African English authors. So I think now this was a solidarity. The key word here is solidarity, that we found in literature in the 1980s, and which we have completely lost track of in 2020. So I would really, coming from a perspective of a research scholar, of an arts commentator, and from JNU, I really feel like going back to that moment of solidarity right now is so important for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. Coming to you, Dr. Raymond, uh, if you can share some perspectives of what is happening in Hong Kong, have you came across any kind of racial discrimination against Africans in Hong Kong?
Uh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Once again, thank you very much for having me here. Talking about the situation facing Hong Kong, I think on the surface, okay, you guys may have the impression that Hong Kong seems like to be a metropolitan, so-called international city. Okay, but the real situation, I would say, is Hong Kong is pretty much ethnicity homogeneous. We are talking about some 92% of the people are actually ethnic Han Chinese, but only some 8% of those are being considered as non-Chinese ethnic minorities. And perhaps what I can share with you perhaps is recently I've got a chance getting access to a leaked document which is related to the hiring practice of the Hong Kong government of the so-called NET, the native English teachers. Actually, the native English teachers are being highly sought after in Hong Kong. And just for example, these are some of the criterions being listed here. For example, those native English teachers, some of the requirements being listed here, for example, they must be white, okay, preferably UK, no black, experience, something like that. So perhaps what you can see or what you can imagine here is this kind of racial discrimination is something like a structural problem. If those criteria are being listed by decision makers, policy makers, the government levels, so perhaps you can tell this kind of stereotyping. It seems to me it's like a pathological one, and I mean this has something to do with the social status or the group position, other than the actual personal characteristics of the people in that stereotype group. So I would say it has been quite a serious structural problem facing Hong Kong. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very strong point Dr. Raymond has made regarding Hong Kong. Coming to you, Foster. Foster, you have been studying in Delhi, as the capital of India. What has been your experience as an African in India?
Thank you very much, Mr. Yadav. So personally, I've experienced stereotypes. I've been racially discriminated before, but I would second with what my co-panelists said earlier on when it comes to the causes of misinformation about Africans. Social, as in, or let's say media representation is one cause. It's really persuasive and it's really pervasive. And as a matter of fact, it contributes to this stereotype of Africans in India. And also, one important thing is the denial of the fact that there's racism in India. As Dr. Michael said earlier on, he went to a conference, and when he was trying to talk about the level of caste system in India and how it affects racism, he was being told that no, it doesn't exist in India and all of that. One thing about racism is that when you try to deny it, when you try to massage the truth, people tend to see it to be normal, and as a result, people don't even see anything wrong with that. So I think denial of the fact that there is some kind of racial discrimination against people of my community, that's Black community or African community in India, is also a contributory factor. That's something which needs to be addressed. And these denials are not being made by mere people, but sometimes it's being made by the institutions like the police and the policymakers and all of that. I'll give you a similar example. In 2016, a Tanzanian student, she was a female student in Bangalore. She was being stripped naked, like she was racially discriminated because a South Sudanese male caused an accident. And this female Tanzanian student didn't know anything about the accident. She was just a bypasser. When she got to the place whereby the accident has happened, they just pounced on her, lynched her, stripped her naked. And it was very shocking that the police came out and said that this was nothing of racial discrimination, because it's very shocking in the sense that this lady didn't know anything about the accident. She didn't know the guy. She was just being lynched and being stripped naked because of the fact that she was Black, and people thought, okay, they are from the same community, and for that matter, we need to revenge or something. So these are some of the things that we need to educate the people. We need to educate people on what constitutes racism, because if you don't accept the truth, if you don't accept the fact, if you don't accept the problem, you never have solutions to it. So I think this is the time whereby every person in the society, institutions, the policymakers, parents at home need to accept the fact that yes, there is racial discrimination in India. We need to educate ourselves on what actually constitutes racism. Yeah.
Sure. I think that's a sad reality in India, when it comes to racial discrimination. Several of our panelists today talk about the role of media and education. Barrister Chooks, coming to you, you talked about international media and the role they play in stereotyping, in perpetuation of this stereotypical image of Africa. Do you think who are the people or groups or communities or political interests which are getting benefited by perpetuating this kind of stereotypical image of Africa?
Okay, thank you so much for that. I would say that generally you would agree with me that controversy sells. Media thrives in controversy. So by showing or by reinforcing racism, or by reinforcing certain stereotypical stereotypical composition or ideas about certain groups of people, you would agree with me that it fits into a certain narrative that the media or the international media is already pushing. So by so doing, they particularly benefit from it. just like a racist leader, a racist leader appeals to certain segments of society by being racist. Likewise, international media benefit immensely by misinforming their audience as to what Africa is or who the African person is.
Great. I think that's a very strong point, how misinformation helps certain political interest, locally and internationally, more in perpetuating this stereotypical and traditional image of Africa. Dr. Michael, your viewpoint on this issue, and who actually gets benefited out of this, stereotypical imagery of Africa?
Well, I think it is in both sides. Okay, so looking at it from the side of those who do the stereotype, firstly, I would like to point out that sometimes it's not really there is a serious motive. They do it without knowing, and you sometimes have to draw their attention to it that, look, this thing you're doing is not meant to be in this way. But overall, just as what Shooks have said, if you look at Africa, for instance, we are kind of the dumping ground for the West, So by the time you also keep on promoting things that will make Africa to keep on being independent on you, it's also going to make your own markets to keep on moving. So there are economic benefits you also achieve from it. Then looking at the media itself, some media houses are set up for profit, okay? So they only look at the news that will fly out, just as what Shuk said, to be able to make out more income from it. But however, I think if we begin to look at this more from a global lens, that is, in this case, I'm advocating that we have something like an international comprehensive agenda to end racism. So what am I saying? Just like we have the 17 goals of the United Nations, we can also have the 18th goal, which is to end racism in all forms. So in this case, it's not really an African struggle that we are looking at. It becomes something that the whole world is mobilized to end. So whether you are gaining from it or you are not gaining from it, we have a global agenda that we are pursuing. So those institutionalized structures in which is promoting this, governments now will pay concerted efforts to take it down. So even when a media outfit is trying to promote racism, it's no longer Africans that will be saying, hey, stop it. Its own government will start pushing it down because it has now become a global fight. And also, there is nothing wrong to establish something like a racism index, just like the way we have a corruption index, we have poverty index, we have the happiness index, and so on. Create a league table also for racism and establish these societies in that order. You will see that most of the societies that we push forward today as the so-called developed, they will be ranking below in that table. And this also brings us to the idea that we can actually be developing in terms of infrastructure and GDP and so on, in which traditionally we look at as the elements of development. But when we look at the core ideological values that bind us as human beings, which is acceptance, kindness, and so on, you see that we are still like 400 years backwards. When we put things in this context, I think it's also going to make other countries to wake up and not just look at it, okay, we are looking at something specifically for Africa, but the whole world is pushing towards this. In that case, I don't think anybody will be gaining from these issues of stereotypes.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea, the racism index, that how racism, in which countries actually racism is more potent and used as a political force or a force to discriminate and socially boycott other races. Shrinkla, coming to you, if we talk about India, there are a lot of African students who come to India every year for higher studies. And there have been a lot of instances of, violence and, with them. In fact, several times African students have been killed also in India. But we have never seen any sustained media reporting in favor of African students or African community in Indian media. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Narender. And just going back to, what Michael was just sharing, this is a structural problem. And earlier we were talking of education. Now I'd like to put the lens on media education in India. Sometimes, or rather mostly, if you look at how media education works, a lot of reporting lacks in-depth understanding or analysis, the history, the context, and most of all, how to understand difference, how to process diversity, how to present cultural diversity, how to present racial diversity. these things are really missing in the kind of media education that's happening nowadays. And I say this with a very heavy heart as an educator myself, but this is what I'm noticing, because it's just not how you put the on-ground facts, but how you process the whole context of it and the whole analysis. So, one of the panelists was sharing about the incident in Bangalore in 2016, and you would remember in 2014 in Khirki extension in Delhi, there was
Yes.
this whole hate crime against women from Uganda. And
Yes.
then as recent as 2017 in Greater Noida, there was this whole mob lynching where one high schooler had gone missing for one night and resurfaced in the morning. But meanwhile, the community residents actually assumed that one of the tenants in that society who were Africans, they felt that they had indulged in some kind of cannibalism, and they broke into those people's house and went to search for that high schooler in their fridge. So it's also this whole absolute lack of awareness and just playing to what stereotypes have been coming on to us from the Western media. So to challenge this is very important for media people, to question this, not just to report, but to do some critical reporting, to constantly raise this question and to look at it through the lens of critical thinking is very important, which is why I feel like, something like the Harlem Renaissance that happened in America in 1920s, a very important African American art movement that completely shifted cultural narratives at that time. I think that kind of understanding, awareness, and identification is required. We think we are Indians, and it becomes about us and them. So the moment you're othering a community, the moment you start othering a community, you're not empathizing, or you're not being together. You're not understanding their point of view, and if you don't understand that point of view, how can you present it in the media? So I think that's a problem of media education that really needs to be flagged up.
Great. That's a very relevant point made by Shrinkla. Coming to you, Dr. Raymond, in Hong Kong media, have you seen any kind of reporting on any instances of racial discrimination, or do you have any regular space for voices of African communities in Hong Kong media?
I would say, generally speaking, the number of Africans living in Hong Kong is still relatively small. So I think the problem facing Hong Kong is the people, they tend to have a very limited understanding of the African community. For example, I can think of an example. Recently, African community, there's NGOs called the African Association in Hong Kong. It's an NGO being set up, I think a few years ago. And what the founders were trying to do is to build, it's about using an abandoned factory, rebranding it as an activity center for that association. Okay, but the proposal is being opposed by the residents, and the reason why those residents were being opposed of that move was that they thought, the African peoples, they tend to be criminals, according to the media reportings, and they also tend to be creating chaos or security issues. And one more thing is, those African people, they are not being able to speak proper Cantonese, according to what the residents said. So actually, that what it reflects, or what this exposed, once again, is, as I said this before, is like a structural problem facing Hong Kong society. So for example, generally speaking, in Hong Kong, the so-called Caucasians, or preferably Anglo-Saxons, they are not expected, okay, to speak or to even to learn Cantonese. Okay, but for those non-Anglo-Saxons or for those non-Caucasians, those people, okay, they are widely expected to learn Cantonese in order to get themselves to be fully integrated into the society. So basically what we are seeing here is, on the one hand, as I said, the discriminatory employment practices being made by the Hong Kong government when looking for the native English teachers. But on the other hand, what we are seeing is something like a double standard, kind of a double standard showing among the general public in terms of their perception towards so-called Caucasians or Anglo-Saxons and other ethnic minorities, including Africans living in Hong Kong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what is coming out quite clearly in our discussion is that there is lack of education, there's lack of information. And specifically, if I talk about India, we don't have much information about Africa. And I think that, and whatever we have is a kind of a misinformation. So misinformation also leads to lack of right information about African culture, about African countries, about African lifestyle. You know, in India, we don't know much about how 54 different African countries, what kind of languages they have, what kind of cuisine they have, what kind of cinema they have, what kind of art they have. With India, there has never been a cultural interaction in terms of exchange of, art, exchange of, cinema, or exchange of theater. So why this has been, Barrister Chooks, coming to you, why do you think, when on one hand we have so many young Africans coming to India every year for higher studies, why there has never been a cultural interaction between these African students and their host country, India, or their host city, maybe Delhi, Bangalore? Because in India also, our cities have distinct cultures. So why there has been no cultural interaction between African youngsters who are coming here and their host countries? Barrister Chooks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think one of the contributing factors is that if you observe, the trend has been in one direction, in the sense that you have most young people from Africa going over to India for studies, and sometimes they stay back, sometimes they go back to their respective countries. We've not had same amount of influx of Indians, into Africa. So until it becomes a two-way street, we may still continue to have misinformation about African culture.
Okay. Foster, you have been studying in Delhi. Have you made any attempt to, talk about your culture? You are from Ghana, I know. Talk about cuisine from Ghana, talk about dialects of Ghana cinema from Ghana with your maybe friends, your peers in the university, or with anyone else? And if yes, then what kind of response have you got from them?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Yadav. Personally, I've made good friends and I've shared my culture with them. I've learned the Indian culture as well. I've even made effort to travel to their home and all of that. To just have a first-hand or experience about the Indian culture. And personally, I remember when I was the public relations officer for the Association of African Students in India in the year 2018 to 2019. We initiated a program. This program was designed to go to the community of the Indian society, like to have an interaction with them, to try and bridge the gap that has existed for a very, very long time. Though we've had historical memories and historical exchanges, but we saw that there were some bridges that we need to try and fill. So our response from the media was not that encouraging. We tried our best. We did all we could do, and that really informed me that the media tends to highlight the negative stories always, because this initiative was something very positive. It had most of the African students trying to go to the society to have like talk with the society, and we were very lucky. We had this association, that's the Association of Social Media Professional. It's also one of the associations trying to talk about racism and all of that. But this is the case. We didn't get the attention of the mainstream media. We believe that if we could have got the attention of the mainstream media, highlighting what we were doing, highlighting the things that we were doing, trying to bridge the gap between the African community in India and the indigenous citizens, I think it would have.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you, Foster. I think media has been selectively reporting only negative incidents about Africans in India. And I think I haven't come across many stories in media where they talk about, African cuisine or African culture or African cinema. I think that is a big space. And I think you're very right in saying that. Coming to you, Dr. Michael, in India, we don't know about African cinema or African food or African maybe, culture per se or African theater. Why this kind of information and these kind of cultural attributes have not come to India, despite having so many people coming to India every year?
Okay, I would like to build my argument from 2 points. First of all, let me just throw more light on what Shuk said. There have been a one-way movement, and I think the central questions we should be asking ourselves is, why is there been a one-way movement? Okay, you see, sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. So people always immigrate whenever they go for economic opportunities most times, or when you see that where you are, what you're looking for is not there, you have to move to another place. And this is also creating some kind of problem for us here, because it's not really everyone that is migrating to India that is actually going for a genuine reason. So the real problem we should be asking ourselves is, why has there been one-way movement? I'm not saying that Indians don't also move to Africa, but when you look at the trend, you see it's more from Africa to India. So I believe that if we do our homework properly in Africa, we'll also be able to make the movement to be in two ways. Then secondly, which I think is the main important thing, is India is actually making progress, and as a developing country, I think they're actually doing modest attempt to internationalize the country. But relatively, the level of internationalization in India is still low, and there is no much of appetite to open up the country. And that is why you still see you as an African, even in the society, they don't really integrate you into their own activities. So in that context, I say first, try to internationalize India very well. And if you look at many Africans that come here, they are not really based in the Indian government institutions. They are mainly in the private institutions. So the central question we should be asking ourselves, if the government is not opening up, how will we be talking about cultural integration between two different countries? Because it's also the will actually have to start from the government first, then private actors will also come into the game. So let me take something like AIMS, the All Indian Institute for Medical Sciences. Less than 2% of the seats are allocated to international students. I stand to be corrected. But then you expect international students to come in and then try to move around. If you don't open up the space, how do they come in? And there is nothing wrong if they come in, you train them with other Indian doctors. At the end, also employ a fraction of them into AIMS. Let them also work with Indians, so that this element of stereotype, or maybe Africans are not innovative and so on, you see that the same thing the Indian doctor is doing is what the African doctor is doing. Africans coming for tourism, we see their own people treating them here. But I think there is this kind of artificial boundary in which the government is actually putting for Africans. And if it does not remove that, India will not be well internationalized. And it is when you have more international experts in your country, or students, as the case may be, that's only when this cultural integration can start working. And as I say, it's going to start from the government first. If the government show the willpower, integrate Africans more, then the private actors also will support. And in that way, I believe this understanding of Africa will also grow in India, and it won't just be something that is one-sided.
So government needs to take more steps to culturally integrate Africans and Indians. Coming to you, Shrinkla, last point. after today's discussion, I realized that we don't know much about Africa. And mainly because, in media, in our newspapers, in our TV channels, in our, social media profiles and social media pages, we have never seen anything about Africa. How, except those stereotypical images of Africans who are tribals and who are, always there is tribal fights happening and things like that. As a media educator and as a journalist, why do you think media has been only selectively highlighting some negative incidents that are happening related to Africans, and they are completely bypassing the positive and cultural aspects of, the divergent African community that is there in India?
I think, it also has a lot to do with structures of power. It has to do with our worldview and our lens of looking uh, at cultures. What is the dominant cultural narrative that we are allowing to happen? Who owns media houses, and what is their vested interest in talking about a certain country, a certain community, a certain continent, and how they talk about it? So all of these editorial choices are, of course, linked to larger economic structures of power. And just also bringing in, what Michael brought in, I think that's really important, that why are people migrating? What is the flow of the migration? And what really are the opportunities that people from Africa are finally finding in India or not finding in India? For instance, I was reading this anecdote about a woman from Nigeria who wanted to do some modeling in India, and she couldn't find any opportunities because for Indian culture, black is not beautiful. As someone was saying that in India, there is this sense of colorism. So it's again a colonial legacy where you feel that fair is the only ideal of beauty, and but we do have things which are then troubling it. So as Michael said, asking these questions constantly. If media is not raising these questions, then well, we have to raise them maybe on social media, on platforms like this one that you've created, Narender. I mean, these are really important to bring up these voices. So like in 2018, this Miss Africa India beauty contest happened, which was the first of its kind. So I think it was really important that it also raised the question of, in India, what is the concept of beauty? How is it connected to skin color, and can we question it? So we have to constantly keep challenging the cultural narratives that are being thrown at us, and have a sense of, positive curiosity. So not in the way that we have of having a kind of fear. The idea is to dispel a fear about a community that we don't identify as ours, and to find points of connection, to find empathy, to really re-establish that solidarity of a shared colonial history. I think it's so important at that time is, and this time when we are in the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement going on. I think that, what has really changed? You started with this question, Narender, and coming back to this question, that if we don't rekindle these solidarities now, then the same oppressive structures of power will reinforce. And this is what we have to question. So for me, it's really important that we look at it with empathy, we look at it with critical mind, we look at it with a positive curiosity, and we engage with these as not just, this is not just an issue of an African student that happened in a certain city. No, it's everyone's issue. It's our issue as a community. So open up that to a community, atmosphere.
So it's everyone's issue, and I think the dominant cultural narratives needs to be challenged to break down those artificial barriers that have been constructed, for decades between India and Africa. So that brings me to the end of this show. I would like to end with a quote by Italian filmmaker and writer Francisco Marciano, who said that Africa has her own mysteries, and even a wise man or a wise woman cannot understand them. But if you can't understand them, respect them. So I think if we can't understand the cultural diversities of a continent or of a country or of a community, what we can do least is to respect them. And I think that is what we expect between India and Africa. Thank you so much, Barrister Chooks, for joining us today from Nigeria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Michael. Thank you, Shrinkla, Sahai. Dr. Raymond, thank you again for coming from Hong Kong.
Yeah, thank you for having me again.
And Mr. Foster Edo, thank you. It was wonderful having you today. And friends, from this week onwards, our Africa Talk Show is a weekly program now. And every Sunday, we will be back on another issue related to Africa and India, so that we can get to know more about what is happening in Africa, what is happening in India, how the African continent and India come together for a shared and a diverse and a culturally enriching future. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and to all the viewers. Thank you. Good night and goodbye.
Good night, Yadav. Good night, panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.